you ever faced a system so vast it seemed impossible to bring it down? I have. My name is David Almeida, and I went head-to-head with one of Wall Street's most powerful men. He controlled markets, swayed governments, and could make billions vanish in the blink of an eye. I only had one shot, and failure meant far more than losing a case. It meant losing my life. But the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. He wasn't the real problem. The problem was the system that protected him.
What would you do if justice came at the cost of your own life? Richard Spencer sat at the head of a long conference table, high above the Manhattan skyline in one of New York's most iconic skyscrapers. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m., but in the world of Spencer Capital, time was a tool, one that worked only for those who controlled it. The CEO, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, exuded an air of calm authority, though the pen in his hand felt unusually heavy that night. Across town, federal prosecutor David Almeida, known for his razor-sharp precision in dismantling corruption schemes, was poring over a freshly delivered document. The sender was anonymous, but the contents were explosive. A labyrinth of fraud and deceit pointing directly at Spencer Capital. As David scanned the pages, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place with an almost surreal clarity. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he realized the scale of the scheme he was about to uncover. Two opposing worlds were on a collision course. Spencer gazed out from his 45th floor office window, his eyes sweeping over a city he believed, in many ways, he owned. He was moments away from sealing the biggest deal of his career, a move that would cement his status as Wall Street's undisputed kingpin. But just as his pen touched the paper, his phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. "We've got a problem. Almeida's started digging. We need to talk." The game was on. Spencer straightened his tie, forced a confident smile, and signed the contract. The battle for power, truth, and control over the financial fates of millions was about to begin. Richard Spencer believed the world was a battlefield from a young age. Growing up in a modest household in Pennsylvania, he watched his father struggle to make ends meet, igniting an insatiable ambition within him. At just 12 years old, while his peers played carefree, Richard was consumed with understanding the dynamics of money, haunted by the frustration of his family never having enough. Those moments of scarcity laid the foundation for an unrelenting drive to control his destiny. Over time, survival evolved into a strategy for domination. What began as a young idealist's thirst for success transformed into the calculating predator Wall Street would come to know. Spencer's rise wasn't a stroke of luck. It was fueled by an almost clinical determination, sharpened by what his rivals called a predator's instinct. Where others saw risk, Spencer saw opportunity. Where most hesitated, he forged ahead. For him, the financial market wasn't just a playing field, it was a battlefield. In the 1980s, as markets began to open up to the speculative capital frenzy, Spencer seized his moment. He was one of the first to realize that true power didn't come from honest deals, but from controlling the market's invisible levers. With this insight, he founded Spencer Capital, assembling a team of economists and analysts who shared his vision. The philosophy was simple: maximize profits, minimize scruples. By the time he turned 30, Spencer was known as Wall Street's Iron Man, not for rigidity, but for his ability to bend the rules without breaking them. He wielded his vast network of connections to ensure that financial regulations always worked in his favor. Central banks, investment funds, even politicians, many unknowingly revolved within his sphere of influence. To the public, Richard Spencer was the embodiment of the American dream, a billionaire who had built his empire with shrewdness and hard work. But to those who knew him well, he was something far more dangerous. A cold, calculating strategist with an almost innate ability to manipulate both markets and human behavior. His talent for predicting the masses' reactions made him formidable. His ability to influence governments made him untouchable. In a rare interview, Spencer once explained his business ethos. The market is a jungle. It's not enough to be the strongest. You have to be the smartest. Whoever writes the rules wins. These weren't just words. They were the principles he lived by daily. As he built his empire, Spencer surrounded himself with a financial elite that shared his ruthless vision. His inner circle included former prosecutors, top-tier lawyers, and analysts who could anticipate market shifts before regulators even noticed. Through hedge funds under his control, Spencer orchestrated billion-dollar bets on companies whose fortunes he manipulated through secret deals and insider information. To the public, Spencer was a visionary. Few realized the strings he was pulling behind the scenes. This rags-to-riches tale of a poor boy rising to become a Wall Street titan is the story Richard Spencer tells the world. But like all myths, there's another side, a darker one. Each of his victories came at someone else's expense. Every triumph was preceded by a carefully engineered downfall of a competitor. For Spencer, this was simply the cost of doing business. He understood that the corporate world wasn't for the faint of heart. The term predator's instinct wasn't used lightly when describing him. Spencer knew precisely when to strike and, just as crucially, when to retreat and wait for the perfect moment. This instinct allowed him to win battles that would have crushed other CEOs, but even the most cunning predator leaves behind a trail. And it was that trail that David Almeida, a federal prosecutor with an unblemished reputation, began to follow as he built his case against Spencer's empire. While Richard signed billion-dollar contracts, the carefully concealed foundations of his empire began to crack under the weight of his own ambition. But the true test of his career was still on the horizon. David Almeida entered the public prosecutor's office with an unwavering belief that he could uncover the hidden machinery of corruption. But the cost of his crusade was devastating. As he won courtroom battles, his personal life crumbled. By the time his investigation into Spencer came to a close, Almeida was no longer the same man. Picture this. Almeida sits in his dimly lit office, the weight of his victories etched on his face. He gazes at an old family photo, a stark reminder of the life he left behind. Later, as he visits his childhood home, the empty rooms echo with memories of a simpler time, of laughter, warmth, and connections long abandoned. The journey had transformed him into someone unrecognizable, a man who paid an irreparable price in his relentless pursuit of justice. David entered the legal world with the cold precision of a surgeon. A Harvard Law graduate with honors, he quickly stood out for his razor-sharp intellect and pragmatic approach. While most of his peers flocked to prestigious corporate firms, David chose the less glamorous path of public prosecution. For him, the real battle lay in the courtroom, where corporate giants and corrupt politicians shielded themselves with impenetrable legal defenses. By age 34, David had become the youngest federal prosecutor in New York, boasting a resume packed with high-profile victories. His reputation as a bloodhound for fraud cases grew rapidly. Pragmatic yet relentless, he had an uncanny ability to sniff out corruption and pursue it with single-minded determination. His breakthrough case involved tax evasion by one of the largest investment banks in the United States. While others balked at the army of corporate attorneys deployed by the bank, David focused on the money trail. A painstaking 2-year investigation culminated in a billion-dollar fine and the imprisonment of 3 top executives. The victory made national headlines and cemented his status as the giant slayer. What set David Almeida apart wasn't just his skill in crafting airtight cases, but his deep understanding of the systemic flaws in the financial world. He wasn't an idealist. He was a realist who saw the market as a breeding ground for unchecked greed and systemic injustice. The system's biggest flaw, David once remarked in a rare interview, is that it's not designed to punish the powerful. It's built to keep them at the top. Regulators and lawmakers, no matter how well-intentioned, end up playing by rules created by the same powerful players they're supposed to oversee. This pragmatic outlook drove him to adopt a surgical approach to his work. He didn't harbor illusions about single-handedly dismantling the system. Instead, he aimed to chip away at it case by case, exposing its weaknesses. Each courtroom victory was a small crack in the seemingly unbreakable fortress of corporate power. But David's crusade came with risks. Taking on billionaires and corporations with deep political ties meant living under constant threat. Anonymous warnings became routine, and he was rarely seen without security. His personal life was already strained under the relentless pressure. Even so, David held fast to the belief that the fight was worth it. When the first lead on Spencer Capital crossed his desk, David recognized the familiar stench of fraud and manipulation. For many, Richard Spencer was untouchable, a Wall Street titan whose political connections shielded him from scrutiny. For Almeida, that only made the challenge more enticing. "What's wrong with the financial system?" he was once asked in a post-trial interview. David smirked, his gaze piercing. "It's simple. It's designed to reward those who know how to game it. The ones at the top stay there because they write the rules. My job is to find the cracks they try to hide." Going after Spencer Capital wasn't just about justice. It was a fight against the very system that enabled men like Spencer to thrive. Spencer's power wasn't just in his wealth or influence. It was rooted in a deeply entrenched structure that allowed the financial elite to operate above the law. Every legal move Almeida made felt like a drop in the ocean of corruption sustaining Wall Street. He wasn't just facing a man. He was challenging a system engineered to preserve inequality and protect those who mastered its manipulation. And deep down, David knew that even with a hard-won victory, the gears of this system would keep turning untouched. Richard Spencer didn't just play by Wall Street's rules, he rewrote them. His power didn't lie solely in understanding numbers, but in manipulating the invisible mechanisms that kept the financial system running for the benefit of the elite. Wall Street wasn't merely a marketplace. It was a web of covert deals, mutual favors, and legal loopholes, all designed to keep a select few in control. Every stock, bond, or investment fund was just another pawn in a much larger game, where the real victory wasn't immediate profit, but the ability to shape the rules that determined who won and who lost. Spencer's strength wasn't about operating within the market's laws. It was about bending those laws to serve his interests and those of his powerful network. Wall Street, the beating heart of global finance, is more than the stock exchanges and high-rise offices in downtown Manhattan. Behind the facade lies a shadowy world of backdoor agreements, insider knowledge, and a network of influence that dictates the market's pulse. The real power on Wall Street isn't in the trading pits, but in the investment funds controlling trillions of dollars. Spencer Capital was one of these funds. But unlike its competitors, which followed traditional investment paths, Spencer's strategies pushed the boundaries of legality. To him, regulations were mere hurdles to outsmart, financial laws just guidelines to navigate. It all began in the 1990s, when hedge funds emerged as dominant players in global markets. Unlike commercial banks, hedge funds operated with minimal regulation, taking on massive risks for equally massive rewards. Spencer saw an unprecedented opportunity, exploiting the legal gray areas of these funds to aggressively maximize returns. The key to his meteoric rise was leveraged operations, a risky strategy that involved borrowing vast sums of money to amplify profits. Spencer wasn't just another investor. He mastered the intricate dance of the financial system like few others. His arsenal included insider information and high-frequency trading, strategies that, while technically legal, distorted markets and benefited the elite. To Spencer, every deal was part of a grander game, one where he controlled the flow of global capital. But Spencer's real genius lay in his ability to manipulate the international financial system to keep his empire untouchable. He created a labyrinth of offshore companies to hide profits and evade taxes, channeling his wealth through tax havens and shell corporations. These entities masked his identity and allowed his empire to expand unchecked. His crowning weapon, however, was his unparalleled ability to influence market behavior. Spencer had an almost preternatural knack for predicting market movements. He understood how investors would react to specific news and weaponized this knowledge. A scandal breaking at a major corporation? Spencer had already shorted its stock weeks before. A new Federal Reserve policy announcement? His well-placed contacts ensured he was prepared long before the news hit the press. This level of manipulation didn't go unnoticed. Rivals knew he was playing a dangerous game, but few dared to confront him. Regulatory frameworks designed to prevent such practices were grossly inadequate and often poorly enforced. Overwhelmed agencies lacked the resources to take on a titan like Spencer. The financial system seemed rigged to shield those who knew how to exploit it. The more Spencer played, the clearer it became. The rules weren't made to constrain the powerful. They were made by them. And as he continued to thrive, the line between legal and illegal blurred into obscurity. For Spencer, the market wasn't just a jungle. It was his jungle, and he was its apex predator. Spencer's methods weren't unique to him. Across the financial sector, others adopted his playbook, creating a system where manipulation wasn't just tolerated but encouraged. While politicians and regulators debated financial reforms, the game raged on. To Richard Spencer and his peers, the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. But David Almeida saw through the facade. He recognized that the financial system was meticulously engineered to protect men like Spencer. Yet he also believed that with the right evidence, he could dismantle the empire of manipulation propping up Wall Street. Spencer's fall wouldn't just be a victory against one man. It would be a battle cry against the systemic greed that had infected the world's financial core. David Almeida was no stranger to the tension of an investigation room, but the envelope sitting on his desk that morning carried a different kind of electricity. The sender was anonymous, a telltale sign that something explosive was inside. Documents like these weren't sent lightly. They held secrets too rotten to stay buried. Opening it meant stepping onto a minefield, but that was exactly why David had chosen to become a prosecutor. Inside were copies of financial records tied to Spencer Capital. The transactions were intricate, buried under layers of investments, offshore accounts, and shell companies. It was the kind of scheme only the most privileged and well-connected dared to orchestrate and hide. But what truly caught David's attention wasn't the complexity of the numbers. It was a simple, handwritten note scrawled in the corner of one of the pages. Spencer never loses. The name was familiar, of course. Richard Spencer was one of Wall Street's titans, untouchable to most, with a network so powerful that the mere idea of a serious investigation seemed almost laughable. But these documents hinted at something different. Spencer's armor might not be as impenetrable as it seemed. Whoever had leaked these records wanted David Almeida to know that. He immediately gathered his team. Maria Vasconcelos, his longtime assistant and the person he trusted most, entered the room with the focused expression he'd come to depend on. She was his rock, the one who always helped him navigate chaos with clarity. "We've got a problem," David said, handing her the documents. "Spencer Capital is involved in something much bigger than we thought." Maria examined the papers in silence, her brow furrowed. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. They'd faced high-stakes cases before, but this felt different. The weight of what lay ahead hung heavily in the room. Their mutual trust was unshakable, but the tension was already seeping into their conversations, now marked by longer silences and sharper edges. After a moment, Maria looked up. "This is huge, David. These are the kinds of transactions that never show up on the SEC's radar. If this is real, we're talking about a fraud network big enough to bring down Wall Street," David finished. The next step was obvious. They needed to figure out who sent the documents and how they fit into Spencer's world. Whistleblowers were rare in the tight-knit circle of financial elites. This was a world governed by an unspoken code of silence, where trust was bought and loyalty enforced. Whoever this informant was, they were risking far more than their career. Wall Street's upper echelons demanded an omerta of their own. Secrecy was as potent a weapon as wealth. In the days that followed, David and his team began dissecting every transaction, every movement tied to Spencer Capital. This wasn't just a case of financial fraud. There was a clear pattern of market manipulation, evidence that Richard Spencer wasn't simply playing to win. He was rigging the entire game. "What's clear," Maria said during one late-night meeting, "is that Spencer never acts alone. He's got a massive network backing him. Lawyers, bankers, politicians. They're all part of this elaborate financial theater." David knew she was right. To take down someone like Spencer, he couldn't just go after the man. He had to dismantle the system propping him up. That meant finding his accomplices, his enablers, and, most importantly, the weakest link in the chain. Then they found their first real lead. One of the names tied to the transactions was a former Spencer Capital executive who had been abruptly fired months earlier. Suspicious, David ordered his team to investigate. If this executive was the informant, or even knew who it was, it could be the key to Richard Spencer's downfall. The investigation was carried out in absolute secrecy. David knew that even a whisper of their work could unravel everything. Spencer's reputation preceded him. The man had eyes and ears in all the places that mattered. But there was also an inevitability to the path they were on. A giant was about to fall, and David could feel the weight of the critical steps ahead. Standing by his office window, David looked out at the skyline of towering skyscrapers. For once, they seemed less imposing. The investigation, still in the shadows, was ready to break into the light, and when it did, nothing would be the same. Not for David, not for Richard Spencer, and not for Wall Street itself. When word of the investigation reached Richard Spencer, he didn't panic. For most, the mere mention of a prosecutor like David Almeida would be enough to sound alarm bells. But Spencer, with his signature composure, had faced seemingly insurmountable challenges before. To him, crises were simply opportunities in disguise. His initial response was methodical. Spencer knew this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war for public perception. The first call he made was to his lead attorney, Peter Wexler, a seasoned veteran in shielding high-profile CEOs from financial scandals. Wexler, who had built his career protecting the powerful from the prying eyes of the law, was already up to speed. "We knew this day would come," Wexler said confidently. "The question isn't what they've found so far, but what they haven't uncovered yet." Spencer nodded silently. Almeida might only have a fragment of the bigger picture, but the real threat was how quickly that fragment could grow. The solution? Buy time and seize control of the narrative. Wexler wasted no time assembling a team of top-tier financial litigators and media law experts. Their strategy operated on two fronts: an offensive campaign to legally challenge every move Almeida made, and a defensive one to manage the media with surgical precision. Simultaneously, Spencer began mobilizing his extensive political connections. It was time to deploy a plan he'd meticulously prepared for crises like this. By the next morning, the headlines in major newspapers still hadn't mentioned Almeida's investigation. But behind closed doors, in Wall Street's upper echelons and Washington's corridors of power, whispers had started. Spencer Capital might be at the center of a financial scandal. For Spencer, the stakes couldn't be higher. Silence wasn't an option, but any public statement had to be calculated to avoid giving Almeida ammunition. The media strategy was simple yet effective. Spencer would position himself as a visionary leader unfairly targeted by a regulatory system incapable of understanding the complexities of modern finance. The underlying message was clear. He wasn't a villain, but a martyr of financial innovation. This narrative wasn't crafted for the general public. It was aimed at his political allies and investors, the people whose opinions truly mattered. Meanwhile, his legal team launched a covert offensive. They flooded the prosecution with procedural requests, demanding extensions, contesting evidence, and making it as difficult as possible for Almeida's case to gain momentum. Spencer understood the legal system's hidden advantage. Money could buy time, and time was the key to fortifying his defenses. The real masterstroke, however, came during a closed-door meeting with a select group of senators and corporate leaders. Spencer knew that to divert public attention, he had to sway the right legislators, the ones whose campaigns he'd funded and whose economic policies he'd shaped. In exchange for their support, he promised substantial investments in strategic sectors, framing his actions as essential to the nation's economic stability, not his personal survival. It was a classic display of systemic manipulation. While Almeida and his team combed through evidence, Spencer was already shifting the political landscape. He didn't need to defeat the investigation outright. He only needed to bury it under bureaucracy and political maneuvering until it lost its momentum. By this point, the battle was still in its infancy, but Spencer, the shrewd predator he'd always been, had already turned the threat into an opportunity. His lawyers had the courts under control, his allies held sway in the Senate, and his narrative was beginning to resonate. For Spencer, this wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about power. And as always, Richard Spencer was determined to win. The war between David Almeida and Richard Spencer was never truly fought in the courts. From the very beginning, Spencer knew that real power resided in the shadows, where politics played out on a board of favors, connections, and secrets. And that's exactly where he thrived. Spencer summoned his allies, a web of influential men and women scattered across the upper echelons of corporate America and the halls of Congress. Each of them owed him something, debts he intended to collect with surgical precision. Behind closed doors, Spencer moved his pieces with unerring accuracy. At private dinners with politicians and CEOs, he rarely mentioned the investigation, yet every word he spoke carried a clear message. Challenging Spencer meant severing ties to the vast financial empire he commanded. He didn't need to issue direct threats. His promises of multi-million-dollar investments and economic incentives spoke volumes. Those who supported him understood that protecting Spencer meant safeguarding their own interests. The rules of the game were clear. While Almeida pursued justice in the courts, Spencer operated deep within the system, ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of the elite. Spencer knew he couldn't confront the investigation head-on. Almeida was a relentless federal prosecutor, known for his integrity and incorruptibility. But Spencer could make his life hell. By erecting invisible obstacles and slowing down the investigation, he aimed to drag out the process until political tides shifted and institutional fatigue set in. On the other side, David Almeida felt the mounting pressure. He wasn't new to this. He'd gone toe-to-toe with major corporations before. But Spencer was different. His influence extended far beyond finance. In just 1 week, Almeida watched as his resources dwindled. His investigation's budget was slashed under the guise of a reprioritization within the Department of Justice. Longtime political contacts started avoiding him at public events, and companies that once cooperated with his investigations began ignoring his calls. Despite these setbacks, Almeida refused to back down. He understood that this wasn't just about Spencer. It was about the entire system that allowed men like him to remain untouchable. Every move Spencer made in the shadows only confirmed that Almeida was getting too close to the truth. The resistance he faced was proof that there was something far bigger at play. A sprawling network of power and corruption that reached well beyond Wall Street. While Spencer manipulated politicians and corporate leaders to divert attention, Almeida continued digging into the labyrinth of financial transactions linking Spencer Capital to a tangled web of illicit operations. The deeper he went, the more sophisticated the barriers became. Almeida found himself fighting not just Spencer, but the very system that was supposed to back his investigation. Behind the scenes, the battle was ruthless. Spencer orchestrated a Senate committee, historically aligned with the Department of Justice, to launch hearings on alleged mismanagement of federal investigations. The timing was anything but coincidental. Almeida was summoned to testify, forcing him to split his time and energy between defending his own reputation and advancing the case. Meanwhile, Spencer tightened his grip, shaking hands with senators and CEOs, sealing deals that ensured any move Almeida made came at a political cost. For every inch Almeida gained, Spencer erected another roadblock. It was a game of power, an invisible war where the victor would be the one who mastered time. And Spencer was determined to control the clock. But Almeida wasn't entirely alone. His most loyal assistant, Maria Vasconcelos, remained steadfast. Time and again, she reminded him that the truth had a way of surfacing. Maria was conducting a parallel investigation, tracing Spencer's ties to influential politicians and compiling evidence that could turn the tide of the battle. They both knew that sooner or later, Spencer's shadowy empire would collide with the unyielding force of the facts. The inevitable showdown between Spencer and Almeida was drawing closer. Behind the curtain, Spencer's dirty tricks persisted, but Almeida knew the only way to win was to drag this covert battle into the light. David Almeida stared at the growing pile of documents on his desk, feeling the weight of something far more sinister than he'd anticipated. His investigation into Spencer Capital had already uncovered signs of financial fraud, but the latest data pointed to a much darker truth: an international web of money laundering. This wasn't just a breach of the law. It was proof of Spencer's iron grip on a global system of financial influence. The first clue came from a series of electronic transfers that, on the surface, seemed legitimate. Small sums moving discreetly through various international subsidiaries. But as David's team traced the financial flows, they identified a pattern. The transactions wove through a labyrinth of offshore tax havens and shell companies, making it nearly impossible to track the origins or ultimate destinations of the funds. Nearly impossible. For David, the challenge wasn't just understanding how the money moved. It was figuring out how Spencer had built such a vast network without raising any red flags. And, more importantly, how he kept it running with such impunity. The trail began with a small offshore company registered in the British Virgin Islands, owned by a former Spencer Capital executive. The company, seemingly dormant, was being used to funnel millions of dollars through a web of similar entities spread across the Caribbean and Eastern Europe. Individually, each transaction appeared legal, but together they told a chilling story of tax evasion and global-scale money laundering. David realized that Spencer Capital's true power wasn't confined to Wall Street. It thrived in the gray areas of international finance. Shell companies were created and dissolved with shocking ease, acting as conduits for hiding illicit wealth. Each new name they uncovered led to another, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. As his team combed through bank records and financial statements, it became clear that Spencer's operation wasn't just about hiding money. It was about controlling a system that allowed trillions of dollars to flow unregulated. These transactions crossed U.S. borders, connecting Spencer Capital to Russian oligarchs, Chinese conglomerates, and European corporations skirting legality. This network of offshore accounts and shell companies was the beating heart of Spencer's empire. Through it, he didn't just manipulate markets, he maintained unshakable influence over governments and institutions worldwide. David knew that dismantling Spencer's network would mean taking down an entire global system, and it would require more than a legal battle. The revelations came faster now, each more audacious than the last. The deeper they dug, the more intricate the laundering scheme became. David uncovered that, beyond the offshore havens, Spencer used phantom banks operating in countries with little to no financial oversight. Cities like Luxembourg and Singapore appeared repeatedly in the documents, standing out as critical waypoints for the billions flowing through Spencer's empire. But with each new breakthrough, the stakes grew higher. The investigation was treading on dangerous ground, threatening powerful international interests. David was acutely aware that exposing this scheme wouldn't just shake Wall Street, it could destabilize global political and economic alliances. This goes far beyond Spencer, Maria Vasconcelos, David's loyal assistant, said during a late-night strategy session. We're dealing with a network that involves entire governments and corporations. David nodded, the enormity of their task pressing heavily on his shoulders. What they had uncovered was more than just financial fraud. It was systemic control, a money laundering operation that propped up the power of global elites. Untangling this maze would mean exposing the vulnerabilities of the very institutions tasked with safeguarding the financial system. The fight against Spencer was no longer a matter of personal justice. David now understood he was in a race against time to expose how illicit money flowed through hidden channels, sustaining entire financial empires. He was inching closer to the core of a web that, if unraveled, could topple the system protecting men like Spencer. For the first time in decades, Richard Spencer felt the crushing weight of pressure closing in on him. His once unshakable reign atop Wall Street was under siege. David Almeida's relentless investigation was zeroing in on Spencer's empire, and the carefully cultivated aura of invincibility that shielded him was beginning to crumble. The walls were closing in, and Spencer knew he had to act. The air inside Spencer Capital's headquarters was thick with unease. Richard, normally calm and calculating, now found himself staring down the very real prospect of exposure. His empire, built on a mix of financial genius and ruthless manipulation, was hanging by a thread. He summoned an emergency meeting with his closest advisors and legal team. "We're standing on the edge of a cliff," he began, his tone a volatile mix of frustration and determination. "David Almeida isn't just some rookie prosecutor. He's too close. We need to do whatever it takes to stop him." Traditional tactics, political donations, media manipulation, had already been deployed, but they were proving insufficient. Spencer's growing anxiety led him to entertain more drastic measures. Once dismissive of such options, he now reluctantly considered bribes and the destruction of evidence as viable strategies to protect his empire. That night, Spencer called on connections he rarely used, power players in politics and banking who owed him favors. Bold promises were made: money, influence, future rewards in exchange for their loyalty and silence. Behind closed doors, veiled threats began to circulate. Almeida would get the message. If he continued pursuing Spencer, he'd be gambling with his career and possibly his future. Meanwhile, incriminating evidence was vanishing. Documents were incinerated in private vaults, and illicit transactions were funneled through shell companies that were swiftly dissolved. The erasure of Spencer's tracks was as methodical as the schemes that had built his empire. On the other side of the battle, David Almeida faced his own storm. His investigation had uncovered a tangled web of fraud, offshore accounts, and backdoor deals propping up Spencer's empire. But as he pushed deeper, resistance began cropping up everywhere. Politicians who once backed him started keeping their distance. Budgets for his team were abruptly slashed, and resources became scarce. One gray morning, David received a call from a senator he had always considered an ally. The message was blunt: step back. Spencer had too many friends in high places, and continuing the investigation would spell political trouble for everyone involved. David knew this pressure was Spencer's handiwork. Yet another attempt to sabotage his case. But Almeida refused to back down. If anything, the mounting obstacles only fueled his determination. He gathered his investigative team for a critical meeting. Maria Vasconcelos, his trusted assistant, arrived clutching stacks of documents. A pattern was emerging amidst the chaos of Spencer's countermeasures, a glimmer of hope buried in the shadows. "We have to stay one step ahead of them," David said, locking eyes with his exhausted but steadfast team. "Spencer's getting desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy." In the days that followed, David intensified the investigation with renewed vigor. He knew Spencer was nearing his breaking point. The billionaire's attempts to cover his tracks were growing increasingly erratic. The destruction of evidence, the whispered threats. These weren't the actions of a man in control. They were the signs of a man cornered. It was now a race against time. David needed hard evidence before Spencer could dismantle the remnants of his illicit operation. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The clash between these two men was hurtling toward a boiling point. Spencer, wielding dirty tactics, and David, armed with unwavering integrity, were locked in a high-stakes game where every move carried enormous risk. They both understood that the next play would determine everything. Richard Spencer, once a titan who ruled the financial world with an iron grip, now faced the specter of complete ruin. As the judge read the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The same hands that once signed billion-dollar deals now trembled slightly, betraying the magnitude of his downfall. His eyes darted across the room, scanning for allies, but all he found were blank, indifferent faces. Internally, Spencer wrestled with a storm of rage and denial. How could the man who had controlled markets and swayed governments be reduced to this? The weight of defeat bore down on him, crushing his spirit. For a fleeting moment he wanted to scream, but all he could muster was a reflexive tug at his tie, a symbol of a past that no longer belonged to him. His mind wavered between acceptance and disbelief. The giant of Wall Street now fallen, rose from his seat without fanfare. His empire, a towering monument to his own hubris, lay in ruins. The end didn't arrive with the dramatic crash he'd once feared, but rather with a quiet, irreversible emptiness. Spencer's behavior grew increasingly erratic. In meetings with his lawyers, his once unshakable composure crumbled. Every decision seemed to slip through his fingers, and in fits of anger, he questioned the loyalty of even his most trusted advisors. The glass walls of his office, once a symbol of his dominance over the city, now felt like a cage, exposing him to the world's scrutiny. As he pored over documents late into the night, his thoughts were consumed by a single haunting question. What if everything falls apart? The man who had commanded the flow of capital now found himself a prisoner of his own empire, even mistrusting the silence in the hallways. For the first time, he felt vulnerable. On the other side of this battle was David Almeida, who was beginning to feel the crushing weight of his pursuit for justice. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by endless hours spent analyzing documents and strategizing his next move. The investigation against Spencer wasn't just a professional mission, it was devouring his life. Friends distanced themselves, invitations dried up, and conversations that once flowed freely now felt strained and brief. His phone rang less and less, except for calls tied to the case. Isolation loomed larger with each passing day, and his obsession with bringing Spencer down became his sole driving force. Yet every small victory came at a personal cost, deepening his solitude. Almeida began to realize that the price of standing up to the system was far greater than he had anticipated. Physically and mentally drained, David's body began to betray him. Team meetings, once filled with energy and focus, now dragged on as he struggled to concentrate. The constant barrage of anonymous threats, initially dismissed as routine, became unnerving. A nagging sense of being watched followed him everywhere, making every shadow feel like a threat. Spencer wasn't going down without a fight. His counterattacks became increasingly aggressive, and the pressure on David intensified. Subtle political moves turned overt. Senators and influential figures withdrew their support from Almeida's circle without warning. His investigation's budget was slashed yet again, leaving his team scrambling to work with dwindling resources. This wasn't just a defense strategy, it was a psychological assault designed to dismantle David's resolve. The conflict was draining both men, but in different ways. Spencer, consumed by the paranoia of losing everything, lived in fear of betrayal from within his own ranks. Every sleepless night was plagued by the thought that one of his confidants might cut a deal with the FBI. For him, the stakes weren't just professional, they were deeply personal. Losing his empire meant losing the very essence of who he was, a man who had built his identity at the expense of ethics and morality. For Almeida, the battle was equally harrowing. As the system pushed back harder than he ever imagined, he began to see the true cost of his fight. Even if he managed to topple Spencer, what would remain of his own life? The final chapter of this high-stakes war wasn't unfolding solely in courtrooms or backroom negotiations. It was playing out in the minds of these two men. Both stood on the brink of collapse, victims of a system that consumed its players, regardless of which side of the law they stood on. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Richard Spencer's elite defense team stood poised for battle, while David Almeida sat composed but unyielding. The case against Spencer had grown exponentially, uncovering a sprawling web of market manipulation and fraud that stretched far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Everything was about to come to light. David felt the immense weight of responsibility pressing on him. Months of relentless investigation had led to this moment. He wasn't just up against Spencer. He was challenging the very financial system that had shielded men like him for decades. As the judge took his seat and the proceedings began, David knew every word spoken and every revelation made could send shockwaves across Wall Street. What he didn't know was just how far Spencer was willing to go to protect his empire. Spencer, ever the calculated tactician, sat calm and collected. To him, this wasn't just a trial, it was a stage. A chance to manipulate public perception and prove that even his downfall wouldn't mark the end of the game, merely a shift in its rules. Behind the scenes, he had orchestrated secret deals, leveraging his influence with powerful politicians and financial giants who had a vested interest in keeping his legacy alive. Even if he fell, Spencer knew the machinery he had built would endure. As the judge reviewed the evidence, David made his move. He unveiled previously undisclosed documents, delivered anonymously, detailing covert transactions between Spencer Capital and an intricate web of offshore accounts. The courtroom fell silent. Spencer's expression hardened as he realized the implications. These documents weren't just an attack on his company. They were a threat to his carefully curated global image. But Spencer wasn't caught off guard. As the damning evidence was presented, he subtly signaled his lead attorney, Peter Wexler. Moments later, Wexler called for an abrupt recess and the court was adjourned. Behind closed doors, the real battle began. Wexler approached David with an unexpected offer. Spencer would admit to lesser charges in exchange for safeguarding his personal wealth and retaining control over his core assets. The deal would hand the prosecution a symbolic victory, an apparent triumph over corruption. But beneath the surface, the system Spencer had built would remain intact, shielded by a maze of legal loopholes and untouchable alliances. David hesitated. Accepting this deal would mean compromising his principles, trading genuine justice for a hollow victory. On paper, Spencer would be defeated, but in reality, he'd walk away to continue the game he had mastered so well. David faced a harrowing dilemma: secure a partial win or risk everything for a complete takedown, knowing it might be out of reach. Spencer, watching from the other side of the negotiation table, smirked inwardly. This was exactly the scenario he'd planned for. David caught between ambition and pragmatism. Spencer knew the system favored him, and David's hesitation was just another tool he could exploit. For Spencer, this wasn't about justice. It was about preserving the machinery of power, even if it meant sacrificing himself as a pawn. After a long pause, David made his decision. Spencer might have laid all his cards on the table, but David had one last ace. Returning to the courtroom, he declined the deal and introduced a surprise witness, a former partner of Spencer's who had turned whistleblower. In exchange for immunity, this insider was prepared to reveal the inner workings of Spencer Capital's schemes. It was a gamble. If the testimony fell apart, Spencer could emerge victorious, but if it succeeded, it would dismantle everything he had built. The trial resumed with a new intensity. The witnesses' revelations were explosive, exposing the full scope of Spencer's corruption. As the layers of deceit were peeled back, Spencer's once ironclad defense began to crumble. Yet even as the walls closed in, Spencer remained stoic. He understood that while he might fall, the system he had exploited would survive. When the final verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in celebration. A titan of Wall Street had been brought to justice, but for David, the victory felt hollow. He knew the truth. While Spencer had been dethroned, the financial system itself remained unscathed, primed for the next player to step into his shoes. The battle was won, but the war against a corrupt system was far from over. David Almeida watched the final verdict with an emptiness in his eyes. Richard Spencer's conviction, meant to symbolize a monumental victory, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yes, the tycoon had fallen, but as camera flashes captured the downfall of the man, David knew that the financial system, the colossal machine Spencer had embodied, remained untouched. The victory felt like smoke and mirrors. The corrupt structures stood unbroken, ready to carry on with new players. That night, while the world celebrated his triumph, David sat alone, staring out his office window. The city lights, once a symbol of his purpose, now served as a painful reminder that the cycle continued. The system he had spent his life trying to dismantle had merely changed its face. Quietly, he asked himself, was it worth it? David felt crushed by the futility of his fight, like a soldier who, after winning a battle, realizes the war itself will never end. Exhaustion overtook him, both body and soul, as the weight of the truth finally sank in. This victory was nothing more than a small crack in a fortress he could never topple alone. Spencer's conviction sent a clear message to the public. No man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For the media, it was a triumph, a win for justice against corporate greed. The figure of Spencer, who had loomed over the financial markets like a shadow, was now officially disgraced. He became the embodiment of unchecked ambition and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate with impunity for years. But for David, any sense of satisfaction was overshadowed by an overwhelming exhaustion. He had won the battle, but not the war. The investigations had revealed how Spencer manipulated not just markets, but the legal structures themselves. His offshore operations, shadowy hedge funds, and deep connections with lawmakers had only been scratched at the surface. Though Spencer was being held accountable, the system that had enabled his rise remained firmly in place. The trial gave the public the illusion of justice served, but David knew the foundations of corporate power Spencer had built were far from destroyed. The past months had been as much a psychological war as a legal one. David recalled every pivotal moment of the investigation: sleepless nights, veiled threats, and the allies who had abandoned him under pressure. He hadn't just faced Spencer, he'd gone up against the very political structures that protected him. Every legal win was met with retaliation in the shadows. In the end, while David had achieved the verdict he'd fought for, he couldn't ignore what had been lost along the way. His victory had come at a steep cost. His investigative team, once composed of motivated and committed experts, was now fractured. Dismantling Spencer's empire had taken careers, personal lives, and a heavy toll on mental health. The emotional strain of fighting on the front lines against the global financial elite weighed heavily on David. A man who had once believed he could reform the system from within now found himself questioning whether justice could ever truly prevail in such a deeply corrupted world. Meanwhile, Spencer seemed to accept his fate with the resignation of a man who knew the game never truly ended. Though convicted, he had hidden much of his fortune in offshore havens, far beyond the reach of authorities. His political allies, though temporarily distant, would inevitably return, and the mechanisms he'd created to bend the rules would continue to operate, ready for the next player to exploit them. David knew it. As the verdict was read, he reflected on the limitations of justice. The case had been a facade of victory, a Pyrrhic victory. The financial system that had enabled Spencer's rise, with its legal loopholes and gray areas, remained almost entirely intact. No laws had been reformed, no structural changes made. Regulators, even after the scandal, were woefully unequipped to handle the next Spencer. The harsh reality was clear. The corruption David had sworn to fight was systemic. It wasn't embodied in just one man. After the trial, David retreated to his office, drained. He knew this wouldn't be his last battle, but something inside him had shifted. He had fought a giant and won, but at the cost of seeing firsthand how the system he represented failed to address the root of the problem. Justice had been served, but the price was steep, and the sense that something larger still needed to be confronted lingered in his mind. In the end, David left the courthouse with a heavy heart. The battle had been won, but the war against systemic corruption seemed endless. As he read the headlines glorifying his victory, he couldn't help but think that the true enemy, the financial system itself, remained unshaken. David Almeida watched the headlines roll in with a heavy sense of exhaustion and disbelief. Richard Spencer had fallen, but as expected, the system adapted with unnerving speed. Just weeks after the sentencing, a new CEO stepped in to take control of Spencer Capital, rebranding the company and giving a fresh face to the same relentless machine Richard had built. The rise of this new leader was yet another testament to the resilience of the financial system, a labyrinth of influence and power that, even in the face of scandals and convictions, found ways to reconfigure and continue operating. To the public, Spencer's downfall was celebrated as a triumph, a moral tale of justice prevailing over greed. But David knew the truth was far darker. He had spent years dismantling Spencer's empire, peeling back layers of corruption, exposing international money laundering schemes and market manipulations. And yet, as he looked at the current state of the financial world, one haunting question lingered. Was it really a victory? The new CEO was more discreet than Spencer, less arrogant but equally ambitious. He swiftly began negotiating with regulators, banks, and investors, signaling that the game was far from over. Spencer's connections, temporarily shaken by the investigation, were being reactivated under a new guise. It was painfully clear that the financial system hadn't learned a thing. The practices exposed during the trial, the loopholes, the illicit deals, the market manipulations, remained, albeit with more subtlety and sophistication. David, meanwhile, bore scars that went far beyond the emotional. The battle against Spencer had consumed his personal life, strained his friendships, and taken a toll on his health. He had entered this fight fueled by a fervent belief in justice, hopeful that he could take down a giant and perhaps transform the corrupt structure that propped him up. But now, with the case closed, David realized the system was bigger than any one man, including himself. In the months following Spencer's fall, David watched in dismay as new financial scandals began to surface. It was like fighting a hydra: cut off one head, and another would take its place. The cycle persisted. Men like Spencer would always be replaced. The global financial system had become so deeply entrenched in its flaws that any real attempt at reform felt impossible. As David reflected on all he had sacrificed, he couldn't help but wonder if anything had truly changed. The battle he had waged was, without a doubt, the most significant of his career. But the system he had fought against remained intact, ready to crush the next challenger who dared to defy it. He knew he wasn't the first to try, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. The epilogue of this story offered no redemption, no sense of closure. What David had achieved was merely a small victory in a much larger war, a war that might never end. Systemic corruption, power games, financial manipulation, these were part of a network he had barely scratched the surface of. And so, as the new CEO of Spencer Capital began rebuilding the empire, and the financial markets carried on with their indifferent march, David Almeida asked himself, did I ever really make a difference? That question, however, would remain unanswered. The system had adjusted, recovered, and continued to function, with new players but the same invisible rules dictating its pace. The cycle continued, and David, now more seasoned and far more cynical, knew his fight was far from over. The conclusion of Richard Spencer and David Almeida's story leaves us grappling with the complexities of power, justice, and systemic corruption. What do you think of this epic battle's outcome? Do you believe the system can be reformed, or are we doomed to witness an endless cycle of manipulation and impunity? Share your thoughts in the comments and spread this story to others who, like you, are fascinated by the hidden forces shaping the financial world.